And so, I mean, it's just so confusing. And then this guy who just smeared stuff in your eyeballs said, hey, get up and go walk. You're blind. Go walk somewhere over and go bathe yourself in this water. I mean, just none of this stuff makes sense. But, I mean, imagine, this man had obviously, 30 years old, hopefully he had a bath somewhere in that process of his lifetime. And, he goes in and bathes himself, and he washes his face, he washes his hair, and he opens his eyes. And there's the world. Now, what about any of that makes sense? Right? Like this, he's just sitting here going, okay, that's weird, right? Like how does this work out? And so people start drilling him, and they start questioning him, and because they're going, wait a second, we know who you are, right? You're a blind kid that's been sitting there for years begging. We know who you are. We've seen who you are. All this kind of stuff. They pull his parents out. They say, hey, is this your son? They say, yeah, that's our son. They say, well, what happened to him? And they're like, we don't know. Go ask him. And so they go and they ask him. And in verse 24 it says this. So a second time they called the man. This is the religious leaders of the area, the synagogue that was there. They called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man, Jesus, is a sinner. Then he answered, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind. Now I see. He basically is looking at this situation, looking at his life circumstances, and looking at the events that had just happened in the previous hour, and he's going, none of this makes sense. And he, like many of us, there's so many circumstances in our life, we look at the most recent events that happened in our life, we're holding the pieces of our existence in our hands, and we're looking at them and going, okay, right, like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do as much as I know, as closely as I know. I'm evaluating my heart. I'm evaluating my motives. I'm looking at what I'm doing. You don't know. So what do we do when God offers confusion? How do we react? How do we live in such a manner as to be able to maintain this tension of faith and confusion? Because we're going to live in a world that doesn't give us all of the answers. So what do you do when God offers confusion? Well, the first thing is this. For we as believers who trust God's knowledge. You trust God's knowledge. Understand this with me. Confusion results from lack of knowledge and understanding. Confusion results from a lack of knowledge and understanding. Have you ever had the chance to sit down with somebody that is just way the heck smarter than you? It happens with me almost every time I sit down with anybody. And you get in a conversation with somebody, no matter what it is. I remember I did a wedding about 2 years ago, and I sat down next to a guy who had his PhD in oil development, refining, exploration, something. He had like this big litany of stuff. And so, if I got his business card, his last, behind his name would have more letters than the English alphabet. And they're just these brilliant people. And so you ask, when you sit down with those people, it's always a polite thing to do, when you meet people. You ask, what do you do for a living, right? Mine's pretty simple. I love people and point people to Jesus. That's the job description that I have. Right? It's pretty simple. And I make the vain question of saying, well, so what do you do for a living? And he tells me in full detail. And I'm looking at it going, okay, oil, I know that, right? Like that's the thing that goes in your car, right? Okay, so I'm good with that. And you find it, right? Is that close enough to that compact? And then you figure out how to get it out of where you find it. Okay, I'm good. I've got this, and he just kind of is looking at me like you're an idiot, right? That's kind of how you feel in that moment. Well, for me, I'm looking at this and going, mean, sit down and talk to an astrophysicist about the mathematical equations of the gravitational pull of the universe. And if you sit down and look, if they drew that out on a chalkboard, the equation of how all of that stuff plays out and how it works, and how this pulls against this and this rests and all that kind of stuff, you would look at it and go, I'm looking at a Scrabble game, right? That's what I'm looking at. There is no order that's here. Or even something very simple as saying, if I were to take a deck of cards and throw it into the air, we would look at that and say, wow, that's under chaos, right? It's how it's going to be. But the honest truth is, it's not under chaos. There's exact measurements of wind pressure and velocity of air that's coming out of the vents, and the pressure of the room, and people exhaling there, and my force of thrust and the surface area of the cards, that they would land exactly where they're supposed to. Because even though it looks like under chaos to me, I just don't simply have a knowledge of everything that's working out in it. So why does any of this have to do with us as believers? Well, it's because when we go through life and we say, God, I'm seeking to honor you, I'm seeking to do what it is that you've called me to do, and when circumstances happen in our lives that just don't make sense, they're just absolutely chaotic, they're simply confusing, we can simply go, well, it's all chance, it's all random, there's nothing in our control, what do we do? Everything is just, it's fatalism. And we just say, well, we can't control anything, so let's not do anything. Or we can step back and just simply say, okay, God, you got this. You spoke the world into motion. You fabricated my body to work in such a capacity that it's just absolutely mind-blowing. Matt and I were having a conversation. Matt's recently started into nursing school, and like every day he'd come home and he's just, oh, didn't we tell you about this cool thing? And so we were talking about just all the way in which our body is orchestrated and mapped out and built in such a manner. And his teacher was making just interesting points. She basically said, look, your body works in this certain way, and it works this way all the time, and if it stops working in that way for a split second, you die. And we're going, okay, so at what point in time did we transition from that not working to it working and us existing where we are right now? Like if you take all of your blood-running vessels and your capillaries and your veins and your arteries and everything out, and you stretch them out, how many miles is that? 6 miles. 2.5. All right. If our blood travels around the earth 2.5 times every minute, 4 minutes, something like that. Okay, that's like pretty insane, right? I don't understand that. I don't know how that works. I hate to be the poor guy that's working on his PhD and has to sit there and count how long all of that stuff is. Like 1 micron, 2 microns. You know, I mean, that kind of understanding of how that plays out. And so we look at it and we go, this just doesn't make sense. And God's basically just going, because it doesn't make sense just because you don't understand. To the PhD in petroleum engineering, it all makes perfect sense. He understands it completely. He knows exactly what he's talking about. Because he spent years studying this. The psalmist writes of our God, he says, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one came to be. For the believer, we look at life and we could just simply say, well, it's fatalistic. We have no control over anything, and so, what is to know? And so we could just simply live our lives for pleasure, seek pleasure, and hope the best and hope it works out. But most people would argue that that's a very bad way to live life. Even the secular humanists would look at that philosophy of life and say, that's probably not the best way for us to live. For us as believers, we live our lives as God has ordained them to the best of our ability, and we trust God's